The story begins with the birth of Shaka Zulu, who was born around the year 1787 in what is today KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. His mother, Nandi, belonged to the Dingane clan. His father, Senzangakona, was a Zulu chief. But there was no marriage between them, and their relationship was not approved by the elders of the Zulu kingdom. As a result, Shaka was considered an illegitimate child, a child without status, without protection, and a recognized place in society. In traditional Zulu culture, being born outside of marriage was not just a personal shame, it was a social curse. It meant that Shaka had no official rights to land, cattle, or inheritance. It meant that his mother was treated as a disgrace, and he, as her son, carried that same stain. Eventually, the pressure on Senzangakona from his advisors became too strong. Nandi and her son were forced to leave. They were exiled, quietly erased from the royal circle without resistance. Shaka, still just an infant, was cast out into a world that had already decided he wasn't supposed to matter. After being rejected by the Zulu, Nandi had nowhere to go. She walked for days, crossing forests and open grasslands with her child on her back. She asked for help from villages where she had no relatives. Most people turned her away. A few gave her food, some shelter. Eventually, she found safety under the protection of the Mthethwa people, a larger and more organized neighboring tribe. It wasn't a warm welcome, but it was enough to survive. Shaka grew up as an outsider. He had no clan name that held power, no family cattle, no inheritance. The other boys mocked him. They called him names, made jokes about his birth, and treated him like someone beneath them. But Shaka didn't cry. He didn't complain. He didn't try to fit in. Instead, he watched. He listened. And slowly, he began to understand people. Not just how they moved or talked, but how they responded to fear, to leadership, to violence. While other boys played, Shaka was training. He copied the way wild animals stalk their prey. He studied how older warriors walked and held their weapons. He listened to the way elders spoke when they were serious, and how silence could be stronger than shouting. Shaka's body grew stronger, his eyes sharper, his silence heavier. He didn't say much, but when he looked at you, it felt like he was already 2 steps ahead. By the time Shaka reached his late teens, the days of being mocked were over. He began to take part in Mthethwa warrior drills and soon joined real combat missions. He had no official rank. He was still an outsider. But when battles came, the other warriors started to notice something strange. Shaka didn't fight like the rest of them. He didn't rush into chaos or swing wildly. He moved with calm, sharp purpose. He studied the enemy's posture, waited for mistakes, and struck with precision. He also didn't get rattled. Where other young warriors shouted or panicked, Shaka stayed focused. He didn't try to impress. He tried to win. His ability to control his fear and to read the fear in others made him terrifying to face, even as a junior soldier. Chief Dingaswayo, the Mthethwa leader, noticed this quiet strength. He began to give Shaka more responsibility, leading scouting parties, handling training drills, and organizing patrol routes. Bit by bit, the boy with no status became a man whose name spread through the ranks. He was still not rich. He still had no land. But he had something more powerful than either: respect, and the kind of fear that others couldn't explain. In 1816, everything changed. Senzangakona, Shaka's father, had died, and his half-brother Sigujana had become the new chief of the Zulu. But the Zulu were still weak and politically fragmented. They had little power compared to their neighbors. Sigujana was seen by many as a soft ruler, a man not fit to lead in a region full of rising danger. Shaka, now an experienced and respected warrior among the Mthethwa, saw his chance. With backing from Chief Dingaswayo and a portion of Mthethwa forces, Shaka returned to the Zulu heartland. He didn't come home as a child looking for forgiveness. He came back as a proven leader. Some welcomed him. Others feared what his return would mean. According to different accounts, Sigujana may have tried to block him, but he didn't last long. Some say he was assassinated by Shaka's supporters. Others say he fled. Either way, the throne did not remain his. Without ever needing to start a full war, Shaka became chief of the Zulu, the very people who had once exiled him. The outcast had returned, and this time he was in command. When Shaka took power, he didn't waste time. He didn't hold celebrations. He didn't take a royal wife or throw a feast. He began working, quietly, ruthlessly. Vision was already driving him. He looked at what the Zulu had, a few scattered settlements, disorganized men, and uncertain loyalty, and began to draw, in his mind, something entirely new. He didn't want to lead like the chiefs before him. He didn't want to copy the systems that had failed. He had been thinking about power for years, through exile, through bullying, through battle. Now he had the chance to shape it. Every rule, every tradition, every idea about what a Zulu tribe should be, he began to test them all. He had no army yet, no advanced tools, no outside help. But what he had was memory, observation, and a hunger to prove that what was once thrown away could return and rise higher than anyone imagined. He wasn't just building a tribe. He was preparing something far bigger. This was not yet a kingdom, but the ground beneath his feet was changing, and so was history. Before Shaka came to power, warfare in southern Africa followed a familiar but fragile pattern. Most battles were short and often undecided. Tribes didn't have permanent armies. Instead, men were called up when needed, usually during emergencies or small conflicts. Weapons were basic, and the idea of military training barely existed. Fighting was more about courage than strategy. Warriors often used long-throwing spears. These were called assegai, and they were designed to be launched from a distance. Once a man threw his spear, he either had to run back or rely on a club or dagger. The goal was to show bravery, steal cattle, or defend honor, not necessarily to destroy the enemy or control land. There were no clear formations, no fixed tactics, and little communication once battle began. A strong start could win a fight. A surprise could end it. But there was no larger system, and because of this, victory was always unstable. To Shaka, this wasn't just inefficient. It was dangerous. He had seen how disorganized movements led to panic. He had seen how quickly a group of men could break down without clear orders. He understood that war could no longer be based on chance or emotion. It had to be restructured entirely, and if no one else would do it, then he would. The first change Shaka made was to the weapon itself. He saw the long-throwing spear, the assegai, as weak. Once thrown, it left the warrior vulnerable. And if everyone threw it once, the army would have no defense left for close combat. This made no sense to Shaka, so he designed a new weapon. It was shorter, thicker, and much more deadly. He called it the Iklwa, named after the sharp sucking sound it made when pulled from a human body. Unlike the assegai, the Iklwa was never meant to fly. It was designed to stab, quickly, deeply, and often. The Iklwa had a broad, leaf-shaped blade about 25 to 30 centimeters long. The handle was short and wrapped in hide for a better grip. The blade was made for soft tissue, under the ribs, in the stomach, or across the neck. Warriors trained to aim for these targets with fast, repeated jabs. The design allowed one warrior to kill multiple enemies in a matter of seconds if he remained calm and accurate. This spear changed everything. It forced battles into close range. It demanded strength, precision, and nerve. And it gave every warrior the power to fight for longer, without needing to run or reload. The Iklwa turned the Zulu from cautious raiders into face-to-face killers. It was the beginning of modern war thinking in southern Africa. Along with the new spear, Shaka also redesigned the Zulu shield. The traditional shield was small, light, and made to block thrown weapons. But now, with close combat becoming the main form of fighting, the shield needed to do more than defend. It had to help kill. Shaka's new design was larger and heavier. It was made from tough ox hide, stretched and dried over a wooden frame. The shape was long, curved, and almost as tall as the warrior himself. It could cover the body entirely when held straight and could be angled to deflect blows. But the real advantage came from how it was used. Warriors were taught to use the shield to push the enemy, to knock them off balance, to trap their arms, and to open their bodies for a stab. It wasn't just a tool to stay alive. It was part of the attack. In battle, a Zulu warrior would swing the shield with his left arm to break the enemy's position and immediately follow with a stabbing motion from the Iklwa in his right. This two-handed system, shield and spear working together, became a dance of death, performed at terrifying speed. The shield no longer allowed warriors to survive longer. It helped them finish the fight faster. A new weapon meant nothing without the body to use it. Shaka understood that warriors needed more than courage. They needed to be physically built for war. So he redefined what it meant to train. Every warrior under his rule was forced to run barefoot, not on grass, but on thorny paths, sharp stones, and dry dirt. This wasn't just punishment, it was preparation. Their feet became tougher, their balance improved, their speed increased. They were made to sleep without blankets, even in winter. They woke up before the sun. They carried heavy loads for long distances without water. Every drill was designed to push the body past comfort, past fatigue, and into a zone where fear stopped existing. Some exercises were silent, like sitting perfectly still for hours, even as flies crawled across their faces. Others were aggressive, like hand-to-hand fights inside closed circles, where only the winner could leave. Shaka believed that once the body no longer responded to pain, and once the heart no longer feared death, a man became something else entirely. He became a weapon. Training individual warriors wasn't enough. Shaka wanted structure and unity, so he divided the army into regiments, called amabuto. Each regiment was made up of warriors of the same age group. They trained together, marched together, lived together. They formed bonds that were stronger than family. Each regiment had its own color scheme, shield patterns, songs and chants. This created identity and pride, but also discipline. A warrior didn't just fight for himself or the Zulu. He fought for his regiment. Losing wasn't just personal, it disgraced the entire unit. The regiments were stationed in separate military kraals, or barracks, spread across the land. These weren't just camps, they were training cities. Inside them, warriors drilled constantly. They learned to respond to signals, to move in silence, and to form ranks in seconds. This was no longer a tribe preparing for defense. This was a military machine, running daily. Before Shaka's reforms, tribal battles in southern Africa were not organized in the way we understand warfare today. When two groups clashed, there were no formations, no command systems, and very little planning. Warriors charged in groups, often shouting, swinging weapons, or throwing spears in open chaos. Everyone moved on instinct, and battles were often decided not by strategy, but by fear, surprise, or accident. There were no generals directing movements from a distance. There was no system for reinforcements. Once the fighting began, it became a free-for-all, and many battles ended quickly when one side got confused or started running. Shaka saw the weakness in this. He realized that to win battles consistently, an army needed more than courage. It needed order, roles, and structure, a way to move like a single body, not just a crowd of brave individuals. He studied how animals hunted in coordinated groups, especially lions and buffalo. Then he created a new method of fighting, a system that was simple, smart, and terrifyingly effective. Shaka called his new strategy the buffalo horn formation, and it changed everything. It was made up of three parts: the chest, the horns, and the loins. Each part had a different job. Each part moved at a different time, but together they formed a trap that almost no enemy could escape. The chest was the center of the attack. This was the front line, made of strong, disciplined warriors. Their job was to run straight at the enemy and pin them in place. They were not there to win immediately, just to keep the enemy busy, locked in combat, unable to retreat or move freely. While the chest was fighting head-on, the horns, fast-moving flanking units, curved outward and around both sides. They moved quietly, using the terrain to stay hidden when possible. Their goal was not to fight at first. Their goal was to surround the enemy from both sides and cut off all exits. Finally, behind the chest stood the loins, a hidden reserve unit. These warriors did not fight at the beginning. They waited and watched. If the chest started to get tired or break, the loins would step in. If the horns needed help tightening the trap, the loins would support. They were fresh, rested, and ready to finish the fight when the time was right. This three-part system made sure that no warrior acted alone. Every man had a place. Every move was planned. And once the trap was closed, there was no escape. The buffalo horn formation was not just about shape. It was about timing, terrain, and movement. Shaka trained his warriors not only to fight hard, but to move with precision. They could march for hours, then suddenly split into curved paths without confusion. They learned to respond to signals from their commanders, hand gestures, drum codes, or specific horn blasts. Shaka placed scouts far ahead of the army. These scouts were trained to study the land and report back with exact details. Where the enemy was hiding, how open the space was, whether there were hills, rivers, or forests nearby. Shaka would then decide how to position the horns, how wide they should spread, how fast they should move, and where the loins would wait. Sometimes he made the horns move so far around the battlefield that the enemy didn't even know they were there until it was too late. Warriors in the horns were trained to stay low, keep silent, and wait for the exact moment to charge in. When they struck, it felt like the enemy was being attacked from behind by ghosts. This kind of coordination had never been seen in African warfare before. It gave the Zulu army the power to win battles before the enemy even realized they had begun to lose. The success of the buffalo horn formation depended on something many armies lacked: discipline. Warriors were not allowed to break formation. They couldn't chase enemies on their own. They couldn't attack early, shout out orders, or try to become heroes. Everything depended on timing. If even one part moved too early or too late, the entire system could fall apart. Shaka punished any warrior who acted outside the plan, even if they survived the battle. He believed that an undisciplined fighter was more dangerous to his people than to the enemy. Over time, this strict rule created a new kind of soldier, one who was trained to think not about himself, but about the movement of the whole. In the middle of chaos, when screams and dust and blood filled the air, Zulu regiments moved like a machine. They rotated positions, protected their flanks, and stayed in rhythm. Enemies were shocked to see a tribal army acting like a professional force, one that fought with the control of a general's hand, not just the speed of young legs. The buffalo horn formation didn't just kill armies, it broke minds. Once Shaka had used the formation in a few early battles, its reputation began to spread. Tribes started hearing stories of warriors being surrounded from both sides, crushed in the center, and left with no way out. Whole villages surrendered without a fight just because they feared that the formation was coming. The strategy became more than a method. It became a message. You cannot run, you cannot hide, and you cannot win if you are surrounded. That fear traveled faster than the Zulu army ever could. Even before Shaka arrived on a battlefield, the fear of being encircled had already done part of the work. In this way, the buffalo horn wasn't just a tactic, it was a psychological weapon, sharp, silent, and unstoppable. In any war, knowing things before your enemy does is a powerful advantage. Knowing where they are, how many fighters they have, whether they're scared or confident, this information can change everything. And even more important than knowing is sending that knowledge fast to the people who need it. Before Shaka, most African tribal leaders relied on slow, unreliable methods of communication. Messages were passed by word of mouth, from person to person. This created delays, mistakes, and confusion. A warning sent in the morning might arrive too late by evening. Sometimes messages never arrived at all. But Shaka saw information as a weapon. He knew that if he could send commands faster, react quicker, and control what others believed, he could win battles before they even started. So he developed a system to manage knowledge, a network of signals, scouts, spies, and runners that made the Zulu army one of the best-informed forces on the continent. One of the most basic yet brilliant parts of Shaka's information system was his network of runners. These were strong, fast young men trained to carry messages on foot across long distances, some of them running over 80 kilometers a day. Runners were trained not just to be fast, but to remember messages word for word. Most messages were memorized through rhythm and repetition, almost like a song. Shaka believed that written words could be lost or stolen, but memory could not be intercepted. To keep them moving efficiently, rest stations were set up along major routes. These were small outposts where runners could stop for food and water or pass their message to a fresh runner. In this way, Shaka could move a command across hundreds of kilometers in a single day, faster than most enemies could even saddle their horses. These runners connected the military corrals, border outposts, and royal settlements into one living network. It was Africa's version of a telegraph, powered not by electricity, but by speed, rhythm, and loyalty. Even more impressive was Shaka's use of drum communication. Long before radios or phones, he trained select drummers to send messages across valleys and hills using coded rhythms. Each beat, pause, and pattern had a meaning, almost like Morse code. Shaka would then decide how to position the horns, how wide they should spread, how fast they should move, and where the loins would wait. Sometimes he made the horns move so far around the battlefield that the enemy didn't even know they were there until it was too late. Warriors in the horns were trained to stay low, keep silent, and wait for the exact moment to charge in. When they struck, it felt like the enemy was being attacked from behind by ghosts. This kind of coordination had never been seen in African warfare before. It gave the Zulu army the power to win battles before the enemy even realized they had begun to lose. The success of the buffalo horn formation depended on something many armies lacked: discipline. Warriors were not allowed to break formation. They couldn't chase enemies on their own. They couldn't attack early, shout out orders, or try to become heroes. Everything depended on timing. If even one part moved too early or too late, the entire system could fall apart. Shaka punished any warrior who acted outside the plan, even if they survived the battle. He believed that an undisciplined fighter was more dangerous to his people than to the enemy. Over time, this strict rule created a new kind of soldier, one who was trained to think not about himself, but about the movement of the whole. In the middle of chaos, when screams and dust and blood filled the air, Zulu regiments moved like a machine. They rotated positions, protected their flanks, and stayed in rhythm. Enemies were shocked to see a tribal army acting like a professional force, one that fought with the control of a general's hand, not just the speed of young legs. The buffalo horn formation didn't just kill armies, it broke minds. Once Shaka had used the formation in a few early battles, its reputation began to spread. Tribes started hearing stories of warriors being surrounded from both sides, crushed in the center, and left with no way out. Whole villages surrendered without a fight just because they feared that the formation was coming. The strategy became more than a method. It became a message. You cannot run, you cannot hide, and you cannot win if you are surrounded. That fear traveled faster than the Zulu army ever could. Even before Shaka arrived on a battlefield, the fear of being encircled had already done part of the work. In this way, the buffalo horn wasn't just a tactic, it was a psychological weapon, sharp, silent, and unstoppable. In any war, knowing things before your enemy does is a powerful advantage. Knowing where they are, how many fighters they have, whether they're scared or confident, this information can change everything. And even more important than knowing is sending that knowledge fast to the people who need it. Before Shaka, most African tribal leaders relied on slow, unreliable methods of communication. Messages were passed by word of mouth, from person to person. This created delays, mistakes, and confusion. A warning sent in the morning might arrive too late by evening. Sometimes messages never arrived at all. But Shaka saw information as a weapon. He knew that if he could send commands faster, react quicker, and control what others believed, he could win battles before they even started. So he developed a system to manage knowledge, a network of signals, scouts, spies, and runners that made the Zulu army one of the best-informed forces on the continent. One of the most basic yet brilliant parts of Shaka's information system was his network of runners. These were strong, fast young men trained to carry messages on foot across long distances, some of them running over 80 kilometers a day. Runners were trained not just to be fast, but to remember messages word for word. Most messages were memorized through rhythm and repetition, almost like a song. Shaka believed that written words could be lost or stolen, but memory could not be intercepted. To keep them moving efficiently, rest stations were set up along major routes. These were small outposts where runners could stop for food and water or pass their message to a fresh runner. In this way, Shaka could move a command across hundreds of kilometers in a single day, faster than most enemies could even saddle their horses. These runners connected the military corrals, border outposts, and royal settlements into one living network. It was Africa's version of a telegraph, powered not by electricity, but by speed, rhythm, and loyalty. Even more impressive was Shaka's use of drum communication. Long before radios or phones, he trained select drummers to send messages across valleys and hills using coded rhythms. Each beat, pause, and pattern had a meaning, almost like Morse code. There were different drum codes for troop movements, attack orders, emergency warnings, ritual alerts, regimental shifts. Every regiment had trained listeners who could recognize their specific signal patterns. These drum messages could travel for kilometers through the open air, especially at night or early morning when the sound was clearest. To outside ears, it sounded like celebration or ritual music. But to Zulu soldiers, it was as sharp and direct as a military radio. One beat could mean, regroup at dawn. Another could mean, the enemy is flanking from the west. This system gave Shaka the power to command multiple moving armies at once, each adjusting position without needing a single written word. No African leader had ever achieved that kind of control before. Shaka didn't just send messages, he also gathered them quietly, and often long before others knew what was happening. He developed a network of spies and scouts, trained to blend in with travelers, visit enemy lands disguised as traders or herders, and report back without being noticed. Some were former captives. Others were volunteers. Many were experts at moving unseen through forests, across rivers, or into hostile kraals. These scouts didn't just count enemy numbers, they watched the mood of the people. Were they preparing for war? Were their leaders sick or weak? Were there signs of famine or internal division? Every piece of information, even small things, mattered to Shaka. He trained his commanders to look beyond the obvious. A group of men sharpening spears? Maybe war is near. No drums at night in a village? Maybe the chief is dead. A sudden silence during the day? Maybe a raid is being prepared. Through spies, Shaka could detect a threat days before it arrived and send orders to counter it in hours. Information is not just about what you learn, it's also about what you let others believe. Shaka understood this deeply. He didn't just gather intelligence, he also shaped it. After a battle, he often allowed survivors from the enemy to escape. Not out of mercy, but because he knew they would go back and spread stories of what they saw. Stories of how the Zulu never tired, how they came from nowhere, how they fought without fear, how their leader saw the battle before it even began. He wanted those stories to grow because he knew something vital. If they fear you before they fight you, you've already won half the war. This control of narrative helped him win battles without lifting a spear. Whole villages surrendered just because they believed the Zulu were already surrounding them. The mind became the battlefield, and Shaka controlled both sides. When Shaka took over the Zulu, they were not yet a kingdom. They were a small tribe, scattered across hills, living in simple kraals, following tradition more than leadership. Each homestead answered mostly to its elders. There was no united government. There was no long-term planning. What happened in one valley often had nothing to do with what was happening in the next. Power moved through family ties and local respect, not through command or structure. There was no centralized tax system, no state records, and no national army. Even the idea of a Zulu nation didn't fully exist. They were one clan among many, surrounded by stronger neighbors. Shaka understood this better than anyone. He knew that winning battles would not be enough. If he wanted to survive and expand, he had to build something beyond fighting. He had to turn this scattered tribal population into a centralized force that could grow, produce, and obey. That meant creating a new kind of society, one where warriors were not just soldiers, but citizens, where families fed the army, where every kraal felt the presence of a single voice, the king. The foundation of Shaka's government was simple. Everything revolved around the army. Every man belonged to a regiment. Every regiment belonged to the king. Young men were removed from their homes and placed in military kraals where they trained, slept, and lived for most of their early adult life. Their food, housing, and daily routines were provided by the state. Women were also reorganized. They were assigned to work groups based on age, family status, and location. Their duties ranged from farming and cooking to raising cattle and weaving. Many women were attached to regiments, responsible for feeding soldiers, preparing ceremonies, or maintaining kraal life. Even land was reassigned based on military organization. Chiefs who resisted Shaka's reforms were removed. Land was divided and placed under loyal regimental commanders, who ruled in his name. In this system, personal power didn't matter anymore. Lineage didn't matter. What mattered was your place in the structure and how loyal you were to the machine. Shaka's state was not a democracy, it was a centralized command society, and the army was both sword and spine. With a growing population and expanding territory, Shaka had to keep people under control, not just in war, but in daily life. He did it using something stronger than rules: fear. Disobedience was punished immediately. If a warrior broke formation, if a chief ignored orders, or if a villager spread rumors, the response was brutal and public. People were executed not just for betrayal, but for weakness, for failing to follow the discipline that held the system together. Burials were often done without ceremony. Traitors were sometimes left in the open, a warning to others. Executions could happen in front of entire regiments. The message was always the same: the king is watching. But this fear wasn't only punishment, it became a tool of unity. People followed orders because they knew the cost of rebellion, and over time, they began to internalize the rules. They woke up at the right hour, they delivered food on time, they trained harder. They gave what was asked, not because they loved the king, but because they feared the breakdown that came without him. It wasn't kindness that built the Zulu kingdom. It was pressure, applied with precision. Shaka did not build an economy based on free trade or open markets. Instead, he created a controlled supply system, one where the state decided who got what and when. Cattle, the main form of wealth, were redistributed by the king. Those who served well were rewarded. Those who disobeyed were stripped of their herds. Villages had quotas: how much grain they had to produce, how many young men they had to send, how many goods they had to supply to the regiments. Trade with outsiders was tightly restricted. Foreign merchants were watched. Information was filtered. No one was allowed to grow too powerful outside of the royal system. There were no coins, no written records, but there was memory and fear, and both were sharp enough to keep everything running. In this way, the kingdom fed itself, not by choice, but by directed loyalty. One of Shaka's most revolutionary ideas was that leadership didn't come from bloodlines. It came from merit, from what you could prove. If a man from a poor background showed discipline, skill, and loyalty, Shaka could promote him. He could become a regiment commander, a land overseer, even a royal advisor. This broke traditional clan hierarchies. Elders who were used to ruling simply because of their names were shocked to see common soldiers rising above them. Shaka understood that loyalty born from opportunity was stronger than loyalty born from inheritance. So he opened paths, narrow ones, yes, but real ones, for people to rise. This created hunger in the ranks. Everyone wanted to be noticed. Everyone wanted to show that they were worthy. It made the kingdom competitive, ambitious, focused. But above all, it made it loyal to him alone. Once Shaka had control over his people, the question became, what next? He had an army that could not be matched by any tribe in the region. His soldiers were faster, stronger, better organized, and loyal. His communication system was fast. His intelligence network was working. His land was under control. There was no more reason to wait. Shaka began sending his regiments beyond Zulu territory, not to raid but to absorb. His strategy was not based on mindless violence. It was based on calculated growth. Some tribes were given a choice: join the Zulu system or be destroyed by it. Others were crushed from the start, especially if they were seen as a threat. What made this different from older tribal wars was that Shaka wasn't just taking cattle. He was taking people, folding them into his army, his system, his vision. He wasn't just defeating tribes, he was deleting them. As Shaka expanded, his movements triggered a massive ripple effect across southern Africa. Historians call this period the Mufakan, a Zulu word meaning the crushing or the scattering. It describes a chain reaction of chaos, fear, and mass migration caused by the rise of the Zulu Empire. Shaka's attacks forced entire tribes to flee. Those fleeing tribes then invaded others, creating more battles, more refugees, and more destruction. Lands were abandoned. Villages were wiped out. New tribes formed in exile. Old ones vanished completely. It wasn't just Zulu soldiers creating this chaos. It was the shockwave of his expansion. The land had never seen this kind of motion before. So many people moving, so many identities changing, so much violence packed into a few years. Some called it empire building, others called it annihilation. But either way, Shaka's name was at the center of it. Shaka was not simply a destroyer, he was a builder, but only on his terms. When a tribe surrendered early or showed potential, Shaka would absorb it. The men would be sorted by age and assigned to new regiments. Their weapons would be standardized. Their leaders would be replaced with Zulu loyalists or reduced to minor roles. The women and children would be integrated into Zulu support systems. The tribe's old identity would be erased. Their totems, symbols, and songs were banned. In their place, new chants were taught. New shields were issued. New loyalties were demanded. To the outside world, it looked like they still existed. But in reality, they were no longer a tribe. They were now Zulu, in name, in function, and fear. Shaka knew that not every tribe could be absorbed. Some were too proud, too hostile, or too dangerous. These he treated with absolute force. His army moved quickly and attacked without hesitation. Villages were surrounded and burned. Warriors were killed in front of their families. Survivors were taken as workers or left as walking warnings. In some cases, Shaka ordered that no trace of the tribe be left behind. No name, no regalia, no grave markers. They were to disappear from memory. These acts weren't just military decisions. They were psychological weapons. News of these punishments spread faster than the army itself. Tribes that hadn't even seen a Zulu warrior were already surrendering, just based on what they heard. This wasn't just fear, it was strategic fear, designed to save time, break resistance, and expand faster. By the early 1820s, Shaka had completely transformed the political map of southeastern Africa. Dozens of small tribes were now part of the Zulu military system. Their old lands were now regimental zones. Their chiefs were now military officers. The border of the Zulu kingdom kept expanding, not in one direction, but in every direction at once. Rival kingdoms that once ignored the Zulu now sent spies. Portuguese traders began adjusting their routes to avoid conflict. Smaller tribes started seeking protection under Shaka, offering cattle and warriors in exchange for survival. The idea of a single Zulu identity, once limited to a small clan, had now become a nation-sized force, complete with laws, structure, and growing influence. Shaka was no longer just a tribal chief. He was now the undisputed center of power in Southern Africa. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Africa's geopolitics, economy, and changing landscape. Let's continue now. One of his earliest and most important campaigns was against the Ndwandwe, led by the powerful chief Zwide Kalanga. The Ndwandwe were one of the strongest tribes in the region, with a large army and control over key river valleys. Shaka's former mentor, Dingane of the Mthethwa, had been captured and killed by Zwide. Now it was personal. In 1818, Shaka faced Zwide's army in a series of engagements. The most famous was the Battle of Cockley Hill. Outnumbered nearly 2-1, Shaka used the terrain to his advantage, hiding troops behind ridges, using decoys, and waiting until Zwide's forces were stretched thin and tired. Then with precise timing, he unleashed his buffalo horn formation. The Ndwandwe army was routed. Thousands were killed. The survivors scattered. But Zwide was not done yet. A year later, in 1819, he sent another massive force against the Zulu, this time aiming for Shaka's capital directly. Shaka anticipated the attack. Instead of waiting to defend, he emptied his kraals, moved his population into forests and hills, and left nothing to plunder. Then as Zwide's army retreated, tired, confused, low on supplies, Shaka struck. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. The Ndwandwe were shattered, their kingdom collapsed, and their lands became part of Shaka's growing empire. Next came the Kwabi, a neighboring group that had once rivaled the Zulu. Shaka offered them a chance to join his system. When they refused, he launched a swift campaign. The Kwabe were defeated, and their fighters were drafted into new Zulu regiments. Their chiefs were removed. Their language and identity were absorbed. He also fought the Hlubi, the Makizi, and splinter groups from the Mthethwa who resisted his authority after Dingiswayo's death. Each of these wars followed the same formula: disorient, divide, surround, absorb. And every time the Zulu army grew stronger, not just in numbers, but in experience. These wars weren't endless. They were intentional. Shaka didn't fight for revenge or fame. He fought for structure. Every enemy that resisted his system was either destroyed or repurposed into it. Every victory was another layer of control. Every defeat he handed out became a warning to the next tribe down the valley. By the time the Mufakan was in full swing, the name Shaka wasn't just feared, it was expected. And every tribe in the region knew, you don't just lose to the Zulu, you become them. By the time the Zulu kingdom reached its peak, Shaka had achieved what most leaders only dreamed of. He had turned a forgotten tribe into the most feared military state in southern Africa. His enemies had either joined him, been destroyed, or run far away. His soldiers were unmatched, his systems were efficient, his commands stretched across hills, rivers, and whole nations. But there was one thing the kingdom could not do: stop. Shaka had built his empire through movement. Constant fighting, constant expansion, constant discipline. Stopping meant standing still, and standing still meant giving people time to think, to doubt, to challenge. So even after the biggest threats were gone, Shaka kept pushing. He created new military drills. He demanded more reports from his commanders. He punished more severely for smaller mistakes. He ordered fresh campaigns, sometimes even when there was no real enemy. His machine couldn't rest, because rest was the one thing that might break it. In the early days of his leadership, Shaka earned loyalty through brilliance. He offered opportunities to those who proved themselves. He created a system where a man's worth could be measured by discipline and courage, not by family name. Many people followed him not out of fear, but because they believed in what he was building. But as time passed and as his power grew, Shaka began to rely more and more on fear. Executions became more frequent. Suspicion became policy. Chiefs were rotated more often to prevent them from gaining local loyalty. Even commanders he had once trusted were watched closely, and sometimes removed without explanation. He created a sense that no one was ever safe. His belief was simple: if fear keeps the lines straight and the heart strong, then fear is a gift. But fear spreads both ways, and it doesn't just hold systems together, it also poisons them from within. In 1827, Shaka's mother, Nandi, died. To the outside world, she was a royal figure, but to Shaka, she was more than that. She was the one person who had believed in him when no one else did. She had carried him into exile, raised him through rejection, and stood beside him as he rose. Her death shattered something inside him. For weeks, he didn't speak to anyone. Then suddenly, he exploded into action. He declared a national mourning period. No crops were to be planted, no milk was to be consumed. Pregnant women were to be killed. Those who didn't cry hard enough at the public rituals were executed. What had once been a kingdom of order had now turned into a kingdom of grief and blood. Commanders whispered that the king was no longer thinking clearly. Villagers began to fear not just war, but peace, because peace gave Shaka time to see too much, to punish too fast. Something had changed, and the system began to feel it. By now, even Shaka's closest circle had started to feel the weight. Men who had helped him build the empire now feared being seen as threats. Some stopped speaking openly. Others began giving overly cautious reports, trying to avoid blame for things beyond their control. Inside the regiments, young warriors spoke carefully. Eyes watched from every corner. Spies listened to songs for signs of doubt. Every conversation could be misheard. Every silence could be suspicious. People still obeyed, but not with pride, with tension. Behind the drums, behind the spears, behind the perfect lines, there was quiet unrest. And in the center of it all was a king who had created the fear, but now lived inside it too. The Zulu kingdom had become powerful beyond belief, but it was also too rigid. Every order had to be followed exactly. Every man had to be perfect. Every village had to perform like a soldier. And in this perfection, there was no room to adjust, to relax, or to breathe. Shaka had built something incredible, but he had also built something that couldn't change without falling apart. Any attempt to soften the rules felt like weakness, Any talk of peace felt like betrayal. Any leader who suggested rest was treated like a traitor. The Zulu machine could still run, but now it was running on pressure, not purpose. And when pressure has no release, it finds one anyway. By late 1828, the pressure inside the Zulu kingdom had become too much. Shaka's grief, paranoia, and increasing punishments had created an atmosphere of silence and fear, not just among common people, but among his top commanders and closest family. Some of them had once been loyal, others had simply learned how to survive under his rule. But now they all had something in common. They felt trapped inside the system they helped build. There were whispers that Shaka was planning more extreme changes. Some said he wanted to expand further south toward the Cape. Others believed he was preparing to send armies across the continent. But the most terrifying rumor was this, that Shaka was planning to kill large portions of the population to control resources and prevent rebellion. Whether these plans were true or not didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that people close to him believed them, and belief was all it took to move from fear to betrayal. The plot to kill Shaka came from inside his bloodline. His half-brothers, Dingane and Melangana, began to plan the assassination together. They had served in his court, watched his rise, and stayed quiet through the years of his rule. But now they saw a different future, one where Shaka no longer stood in their way. They were not alone. They had help from Mbofa, one of Shaka's trusted bodyguards. Mbofa knew the routines of the king. He knew the layout of the royal kraal. And more importantly, he understood when Shaka was most vulnerable. They did not act in public. They did not speak loudly. Every move was quiet, careful, and timed to precision. Because if they failed, they would not only die, their names would be erased, their families slaughtered, their legacy buried. This was a high-risk plan against the most feared man in Africa. They would only get one chance. The day came quietly. It was not during battle. It was not in the middle of a speech. Shaka was inside his private enclosure, relaxed, unarmed, and unaware. Mbofa arrived first. As a personal servant, he had access. He spoke to Shaka, calmed him, and distracted him. Then at the signal, Dingane and Malangana entered. They didn't come as warriors. They came as brothers, silent, smiling, and cold. They surrounded him. Some say Shaka fought back. Others say he didn't even have time to rise. But within moments, he was stabbed multiple times, and his body fell to the ground. There was no shouting, no announcement, no ceremony. The king of the Zulu had been killed, not by enemies, but by the people who shared his name. After the murder, something strange happened. There was no royal funeral, no public display, no official burial site. Shaka's body disappeared. Some believe it was buried in secret near the royal kraal to prevent followers from turning the grave into a shrine. Others say the body was thrown into a dry riverbed and covered with stones. A few legends claim that loyal servants took the body and hid it in a cave, far away in the mountains, protecting it from both his enemies and the spirits of the dead. To this day, the exact location of Shaka's remains has never been found. This mystery only added to the fear, because if a king's body vanishes, his spirit never truly leaves. After the assassination, there was no immediate chaos. There was no war of succession. Dingane, one of the plotters, simply took the throne. People did not protest. They did not resist. Most were quiet, not because they agreed with the killing, but because they were exhausted. Years of expansion, of war, of pressure, of mourning had drained the kingdom. The system kept moving, but something inside it had gone dark. The fear that had once kept the people in line was now the same fear that kept them from asking questions. Shaka's name was not banned. It was still respected, but people spoke it with caution. Even those who had hated him couldn't speak proudly about his death, because no matter what he had become at the end, they all knew what he had been at the beginning, and now that beginning was gone. Now, if you are thinking Shaka's kids became the new leader, then you are wrong. Shaka Zulu never married. He had no known children, and it wasn't by accident. This wasn't just a personal choice. It was a deliberate political strategy, a psychological move, and possibly the most radical part of his leadership philosophy. In almost every royal dynasty, Marriage is not just a personal affair. It's a political weapon. Kings marry to create alliances, to secure bloodlines, to pass power without chaos. In African kingdoms, this was especially true. Marriages connected tribes. Children became heirs. Dynasties lasted through generations. But Shaka Zulu refused all of that. He never married. He had no recognized sons or daughters. He left behind no family of his own. To some, this seemed like madness. To others, weakness. But when you look closer, it becomes clear. This was one of the most calculated decisions Shaka ever made. Shaka believed that family creates weakness, that love softens the will, that personal relationships could become points of betrayal, tools for rivals to use against him. He had seen what happened when chiefs played favorites, when power was inherited instead of earned. He had been cast out as a child because of family politics, and he swore never to let that happen under his rule. He told his regiments time and again, a soldier's loyalty must be to the king, not to his wife or his sons. He banned marriage among young warriors while they served. He controlled sexual access, regulated family life inside the kraals, and expected his commanders to put the stake on personal desire. But Shaka didn't just stop others from building families. He denied himself the same thing. Some scholars believe he may have had lovers, possibly even children in secret, but none were ever acknowledged. There is no accepted record of any heir, no queen, no line of succession. He had power, he had control, but he had no one to carry his blood. When he died, his kingdom passed not to a son, but to a brother, one of the very men who helped kill him. And this too may have been part of Shaka's unspoken plan. If the system cannot survive without me, it was not worthy of surviving. When Shaka was killed, his half-brother Dingane moved quickly to claim power. There was no election, no ceremony of approval, no public debate. Dingane had been part of the assassination, and he used that silence to step into the vacuum. At first, he kept many of Shaka's systems in place. The regiment still operated. The kraals still obeyed. The drum signals still echoed across the hills. But Dingane ruled differently. Where Shaka had been a military commander, Dingane was more of a political survivor. He didn't want endless expansion. He didn't want to be at war forever. His first major act was to slow things down. He ended Shaka's plan for further invasions. He recalled distant regiments. He allowed more traditional leaders to regain small bits of local control. These changes were small but important. They signaled something deeper. The era of constant fear was ending, but so was the energy that fear had created. Under Shaka, people obeyed because they were afraid not to. The system worked like a tightrope, balanced but under pressure. Once that pressure was lifted, things began to loosen. Some commanders started testing boundaries. Some kraals failed to meet quotas. Villagers who had once performed rituals without question now hesitated or made excuses. The machine still moved, but slower, with more mistakes, more cracks, and more room for personal ambition. Even inside the regiments, the discipline began to fade. Shaka's military kraals had been places of total control. Soldiers lived, trained, and served in perfect rhythm. Under Dingane, the rhythm softened. The chain of command lost some of its bite. Loyalty didn't disappear completely, but it began to spread outward, away from the center, back into smaller tribes, older customs, and forgotten rivalries. Even though Shaka was gone, his memory remained heavy. Many people still feared his name. Mothers used it to frighten disobedient children. Chiefs spoke it quietly, unsure whether it was safe to praise or condemn him. His image, tall, silent, unshakable, had become larger than life. Some said he was still alive, hiding in the mountains. Others claimed he had become a spirit, walking the land, watching the regiments at night. A few said his body had been hidden for a reason, because his return was not meant to be stopped. But these were only stories. The real man was gone. What remained was the legend. And like all legends, it began to split into two versions. To some, Shaka was a monster, a bloodthirsty ruler who killed his people and ruled by terror. To others, he was a genius, a leader who took a forgotten tribe and carved an empire from the dust. Both versions were now alive, but neither was fully true. After Shaka's death, outsiders began watching more closely. The British had already heard stories of his battles, his warriors, and his discipline. They respected his force, but they also feared it. With Shaka gone, they saw a chance to divide and weaken the system he left behind. They began offering trade deals, political recognition, and military alliances, not to strengthen the Zulu, but to control them. Dingane, caught between trying to maintain power and dealing with internal pressure, began interacting more with colonial forces. Over time, this would open a door that would never fully close. In 1838, the growing threat came not from within, but from the Boers, Dutch descended settlers moving inland from the Cape. They demanded land. Dingane at first tried diplomacy, but eventually massacred a Boer delegation. This triggered a war. The Zulu were strong, but the Boers had guns, wagons, and tactics that disrupted traditional formations. Dingane's forces were defeated at the Battle of Blood River, and within a few years he was overthrown by another half-brother, Mpande. Mpande ruled longer than any Zulu king, over 30 years, but he did so by making compromises. He cooperated with the Boers. He allowed Zulu lands to be divided and weakened. Though the military system still existed, it was aging. The fierce regiments of Shaka's era were now ceremonial. The kingdom still existed, but it was no longer expanding. It was surviving. In 1872, Cetshwayo, Mpande's son, took the throne, and he tried to revive the Zulu military power. He brought back strict training. He restored the Amabutho regiments. He built a force of 20,000 to 30,000 warriors and tried to unify the kingdom once more. But by then, the British had come. The British Empire saw the Zulu revival as a threat to its control in southern Africa. In 1879, they launched the Anglo-Zulu War, expecting an easy victory. Instead, they were met with one of the greatest shocks in colonial history. On January 22, 1879, 20,000 Zulu warriors attacked a British camp at Isalwana. The British had guns, cannons, and European training. The Zulu had spears, shields, and perfect timing. Using a modified buffalo horn formation, Cetshwayo's army surrounded the British, overwhelmed them, and killed over 1,300 soldiers, the greatest defeat the British Empire ever suffered at the hands of an African army. The world was stunned. London was humiliated. And for a brief moment, the Zulu stood taller than the empire. But the victory was short-lived. The British regrouped, brought in reinforcements, and returned with new strategies and firepower. In July 1879, they attacked the Zulu capital, Ulundi, with over 17,000 men. This time, they didn't make mistakes. The Zulu were defeated. The royal kraal was burned. Cetshwayo was captured. The kingdom was divided. The Zulu state was never the same again. Even after Ulundi, resistance continued. New leaders emerged. New uprisings sparked. The Zulu spirit refused to break. But by the early 1900s, with South Africa under white rule, the once great Zulu kingdom was now a collection of districts, overseen by colonial officials, its power reduced to symbols and ceremonies. Once the outsiders stepped in, the story of Shaka and the Zulu was no longer told only by Africans. It was now told in foreign books, on foreign ships, and in foreign tongues. The people who feared Shaka tried to forget him. The people who conquered his legacy tried to rewrite him. Missionaries, traders, and colonial writers described him as mad. They called him cruel, violent, and insane. They compared him to tyrants in Europe and Asia, even though they never fully understood his system or his reasons. Why did they do this? Because they needed to erase the proof that Africa could produce its own empire without Europe. Shaka had built a government, a military, an economy, and a cultural identity with no help from the outside world. And that was dangerous. So they changed the story. They turned a king into a killer, a planner into a savage, a leader in a lesson. But not everyone forgot, and not every story died. Shaka Zulu was never supposed to rise. He was born into rejection. He grew up as an outsider. He was beaten, insulted, erased. And yet he came back, not just to rule, but to rebuild the very idea of what power looked like in Africa. He changed warfare. He changed society. He redrew the map with his bare hands. His army didn't just fight. It moved like a living code. His government didn't rely on bloodlines. It relied on loyalty and control. He didn't just create an empire, he engineered one. And yet, when we look at him now, the world can't agree on what he was. To some, he's a military genius, Africa's Napoleon. To others, he's a tyrant, obsessed with fear and violence. To many, he's a symbol of pride, power, and pain. To the West, for a long time, he was simply a monster in a loincloth. Why can't we agree? Because Shaka Zulu became too big to define. He was not just a man, he became a mirror. And every generation has seen something different in his reflection. Most of what we know about Shaka comes from European accounts, especially those written after his death. Missionaries, traders, and colonial officials described him with dramatic detail: unpredictable, bloodthirsty, paranoid, cruel. They claimed he killed thousands of his people, banned marriage, and celebrated pain. But many of these writers never met him. Their sources were often secondhand. Their motives were not neutral. What they rarely described, or chose not to understand, were his reforms, his logic, and his vision. They saw violence, but they missed the system behind it. They saw fear, but they didn't understand how that fear kept a rising kingdom together. Meanwhile, Zulu oral history tells a different story. In those accounts, Shaka is not perfect, but he is clear-minded, focused, and fair. He is hard but just. He is feared but also respected. He is not mad, he is methodical. And when you place both versions side by side, one thing becomes obvious. The full truth is somewhere in between, but it's much closer to greatness than we've been told. But why did so many writers try to turn Shaka into a savage? Because he proved something they didn't want to admit: that Africa could lead itself, that an African mind could create a complex government, deep military logic, and high-level organization without European help, religion, or guidance. Shaka broke their story. He wasn't a tribal warlord. He was a state builder. He didn't fight like a bandit. He fought like a general. He didn't rise by luck. He rose by strategy. And that was dangerous, so they rewrote him. They turned his structure into madness, his discipline into cruelty, his intelligence into rage. Because if the world saw who Shaka was, it would have to change how it sees Africa too. Today, statues of Shaka stand in South Africa. Streets carry his name. Movies and books use his face. He's been turned into a symbol of strength, of unity, of pride. But his real legacy isn't carved in stone. It lives in what he built and how he built it. He took exile and turned it into power. He took a broken tribe and turned it into a kingdom. He took ideas, discipline, communication, planning, and turned them into a living system that outlived him. He was harsh. He was feared. But he was also calculated, focused, and far ahead of his time. And for that, the world still doesn't know what to do with him. So who was Shaka Zulu? He was not a monster. He was not a saint. He was a product of pain, a master of systems, and a ruler shaped by survival. He understood people. He understood power. And he understood the one thing that many kings never do. It is not enough to win the war. You must make them believe you cannot be defeated. And he did. Even after all the battles, the expansion, the betrayal, and the rewriting, one part of Shaka Zulu's story still refuses to be buried. It is said that Shaka did not leave the world empty-handed. According to long-held oral traditions, Shaka had a personal hoard, not just of cattle, but of gold, ivory, ironwork, ceremonial weapons, and personal treasures collected during his reign. He did not trust others with it. He did not store it in royal kraals. Instead, he chose to hide it. Some say that in his final years, Shaka ordered a secret team of warriors to carry his treasure into the Drakensberg Mountains, far beyond enemy reach. There, among cliffs and caves, a chamber was sealed, not with doors, but with rock and memory. Only a few knew its location, and when Shaka died, those few vanished as well. There are even older legends, whispered, never written, that his body was placed in that same hidden cave, preserved alongside his most powerful weapons, not to be mourned, but to be guarded, waiting for a time when his spirit would rise again. In the 1920s, strange rumors emerged. A British trader claimed to have seen a golden headpiece, shaped like a horned crown, in a private London collection. It was said to have Zulu carvings, symbols no living scholar could read. The headpiece disappeared soon after. It has never been seen again. Modern search parties have entered the mountains with satellite maps and metal detectors. Some came back empty, some never came back at all. Others were stopped by Zulu elders who believed the cave must never be found, because to disturb it would be to awaken a power that was buried for a reason. No one can prove the treasure exists. No one can say where his bones lie. And yet, the legend has never died, because in the heart of Africa, stories are not just stories. They are maps, they are warnings, and they are keys to secrets buried deeper than any grave. So maybe the final truth of Shaka Zulu isn't in the books. Maybe it's in a cave, still waiting, still guarded, still alive. Shaka Zulu lived and ruled more than 2 centuries ago. He left no written books. He died without children. His bones were never found. His tomb, if it exists, lies hidden somewhere beneath stone, soil, or legend. And yet his presence hasn't faded with time. In fact, his fingerprints are still all over the Africa we know today. Not in monuments or ruins, but in the invisible architecture of ideas. He lives not through bloodlines, but through blueprints. The first and perhaps the most lasting of his gifts is this. He proved that African power didn't need Europe to exist. Long before colonization, long before maps were redrawn in Berlin conference halls, long before European scholars debated whether Africa had civilizations, Shaka had already built a working state, from memory, exile, instinct, and precision. He engineered a military force with formations more advanced than many European armies at the time. He forged a centralized structure where loyalty outweighed lineage. He united fragmented tribes into a single national identity under one banner, without European guns, guidance, or permission. He didn't wait to be civilized. He redefined civilization. Today, when African nations speak of sovereignty, of unity, of building systems that reflect African values and not colonial leftovers, they're walking in the footsteps Shaka carved with blood and brilliance in a time when the idea of African statehood had no textbook definition. But his impact didn't end in the 1800s. It moved across time, across borders, across freedom movements. In the 20th century, African revolutionaries didn't just study the French Revolution or the Russian uprisings. They looked inward, back toward home. Kwame Nkrumah referenced the need for discipline and centralized strength, principles that Shaka lived by. Thomas Sankara admired how identity could be weaponized for dignity. Nelson Mandela, a Xhosa man from the very region where Zulu dominance once stretched, recognized the symbolic power of a united African front, inspired by Shaka's unshakable vision of loyalty, structure, and strength. These leaders knew that freedom was not just about removing colonial flags. It was about building something original in their place. And in Shaka, they saw the first draft of that dream. In South Africa, the cultural memory of Shaka Zulu goes even deeper. It's not just history, it's identity. The name Zulu no longer belongs to a single tribe. It has become a national symbol, worn with pride on clothing, echoed in political speeches, danced to in music, and honored in military parades. The Zulu regimental system, once a military mechanism, became a metaphor during apartheid, a way to organize resistance, to move as one, to act with discipline in the face of chaos. Even today, the Zulu salute is seen in ceremonial ranks and national defense displays. Zulu leadership customs, built on layers of respect, command, and symbolism, still influence how traditional councils interact with democratic governments. In a world that often separates culture from politics, South Africa still balances both, in no small part because of the structure Shaka introduced. And despite colonization, despite the fall of the kingdom, despite the borders that split it apart, the Zulu monarchy still exists, now symbolic but respected. Its lineage can be traced back to the same boy who was once cast out of his father's kraal and told he didn't belong. His language, once spoken by outcasts and soldiers, is now spoken by over 12 million people, making it one of the most widely spoken languages in all of Africa. His story is taught in classrooms, not just across South Africa, but across the world. It's printed in textbooks, filmed in documentaries, staged in plays, and adapted into modern media. And in all of it, the question remains, how did one man with no throne, no books, no Western support, create something that still echoes through the bones of a continent? The answer is simple. He never asked for recognition. He built it. He didn't beg the world to listen. He made himself unforgettable. And maybe most importantly, he gave Africa a template, not a perfect one, not one without pain, but one built from the ground up, using nothing but what he had. He wasn't perfect, but he was real. And because of that, Africa will never be the same. Now, when they tell you Africa has no history, will you agree? Let us know in the comments section, what do you think about Shaka? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: African politics, economy, and increasing power. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.